So welcome everybody to the REFramework, Modify the Framework Developer Series tonight. And Chris, if you want to go to the next slide. I'm Diana Gray. I'm the Community Marketing Manager for the Americas, and I'm hosting tonight's session with Chris. I'll actually be answering any questions you guys have in chat and giving those to Chris to answer. And then also, I'll be adding some links to some other things that we do in the next session of this REF framework series. And then we also have Chris Bolin, who's a senior analyst for Mary Kay, and he's also an MVP with us at UiPath. And if you want to go to the next slide. So this is the America Developer Community Sessions. This is the second one we've had, and it's basically being hosted, or the speakers are from Canada, Latin America, and USA, and they're made up of our MVPs from UiPath. So we encourage you guys to network on these calls, ask questions. These sessions are really developed for you so that you really get to understand these topics and have an opportunity in a safe environment kind of to ask what you want, get the help you need. So it's really to engage. And if you have any additional topics that you're interested in, just please put them on chat, or you can email me to let me know that there's something else you're interested in. And if you go to the last slide. So tonight is the second session of our ARIA framework developer series. And the next one will be October 3rd. We're going to skip a week. And that goes through the queues configuration and grading within the states. And then the last one is on October 10th. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris and let him get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. All right, guys. So last week, I don't know who was here last session or who was not, but just a quick overview. We basically just went through and we did a high-level overview of the RE framework. Got into a little bit of the weeds with some questions that were asked, and you're welcome to ask any questions that you want to ask. And if you remember, if you were here last week, we talked about how the RE framework is a default template. It's a state machine that is set up to work primarily with transactions. And so tonight, since sometimes we have, at Mary Kay, I know we have what we call click-through automations, where we're clicking through a system application just to get the processing done within the application, or we use Excel spreadsheets, we load data into queues. We're going to talk tonight how to modify that original RE framework into what I call actually a linear process, and that may be a global term for UiPath, I'm not sure. So before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the dispatcher and performer model. Some people, we talked last week, may call it a producer-consumer model. In those models, that's where you're going to have an automation. We call them at Mary Kay, we call them queue builds, where you're going to have the automation that processes data and loads it into an orchestrator queue. And then you're going to have a separate automation that then performs and processes that queue data. In a nutshell, high level, that's what a dispatcher performer does. And the reason that in Mary Kay, you will not find at Mary Kay, for example, we do not read a spreadsheet in RE framework and process rows in a spreadsheet. We do everything through our orchestrator queues. And there's a couple reasons for that. We do that for audit purposes, because I do build for the finance division, processing invoices, processing bank reconciliations, any type of account reconciliations. All of that becomes auditable work that the bot does. And if you've ever worked with an audit team, whether it's internal or external, if they're not really familiar with RPA, or it's new to them, or even if it's not new to them, they get very nervous about a bot performing financial tasks. And so we try to use those queues as often as possible in our automation, so that we can get that queue history. We can support an audit request. So you'll find in my business, my COE, that we're using queues. So we have a lot of what we call linear processes that just build the queue. And they're all based in the REFramework, even though they're not transactional. I'm going to show you two ways that we can modify that REFramework. One is a way that's probably going to be used if you go out, like I mentioned last week, if you go out to YouTube and you do a search on how to modify an REFramework to a linear process, you're probably going to do it. They're probably going to show you the way to do it like I do it, where we're getting rid of a piece of that framework. In some instances, and there's another way to do that where you don't get rid of anything, but you still have to change some things. So we're going to start there with the modifying the REFramework. All right, so I'm going to pull up. This is a typical REFramework. Can you see my screen, Diane?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. This is a typical REFramework. And when we're doing a linear processing, it's this guy right here that we want to deal with, okay? And some of our exception planning over here. So last week we used the analogy, we were baking batches of cookies and each batch of cookies was a transaction. And each one of those transactions involved measuring a certain amount of ingredients, preparatory states, and then we ended up processing each of those transactions to our end state. We took all of our cookies to the bake sale. In this instance, if you're like me, I was a single dad since my child was in elementary school. If you're like me, when it's time for a bake sale at school or the PTA, your last minutes, you're running up to Walmart or your local grocery store, you go into the dairy aisle and you find the packets of pre-made cookies that all you have to do is pull them off the sheet, put them on a cookie sheet and throw them in the oven. There's no mixing. There's no measuring. They're already cut, and sometimes they have little Christmas trees in the middle of them. Sometimes they have little pumpkins or whatever holiday season it might be. And you cook those up, they turn into cookies, take them to the bake sale. And you'll see a lot of those cookies at the bake sale because, especially if you have a lot of kids that were with single dads or single moms. They're actually pretty good cookies too. So we really don't need this get transaction data piece. So if you remember in our primary, in our initialization state, we had our materials, we had our packages of cookies. We turned on our stove to preheat our stove. We have the cookie sheets. We're putting our cookies on the cookie sheets. Not a lot of thought process in it. We may glance at the package of the cookies, say, okay, you need to bake it at 375 for 11 minutes. Okay, that's all the preparatory states we have to do. So what we want to do then, if you remember in a state machine, the bot's going to stay in this state until we give it a path out. So in a typical REFramework, the next step after this is going to be into this transaction data. So this is the guy that we want to get rid of. Now, developers will pretty much, most developers I know, actually, I can't say all because I can't speak for everybody, are going to say, okay, let's get rid of this block. Let's get rid of this state. And you can do that. A couple things you have to do first. First, we need to take our business exception because if you remember our business exception, if we run into a business rule exception, it's going to go get the next transaction. We're not going to do another transaction. We need to get our business exception. So far, we have a business exception. We want it to go to the end. So we're just going to drag that over there. All right. Our success, that means when we're done baking, we're done baking. We're not going to go get another transaction. We're going to go to the end. So we're going to drag our success over. Well, we're going to try and drag our success over. How's that? Now, again, this is one of two ways to modify your framework. We'll go through the other way in just a moment. And then what we do is, at that instance, we're going to drag this guy. If you remember, in our initialization state, we're preheating our stove. We're getting our cookie sheets out and such as that. So we're going to, once we're successfully completed all those small preparatory states, we're going to drag that guy down here to our process transactions. We're going to totally circumvent this guy. All right. We're done. We're going to circumvent this guy so we can delete him. And then if you're a little bit OCD like me, I like to have my things lined up simply because I am OCD. All right. So what we've done is we've gone from initialization to process. This is a typical dispatcher linear process. We can bring in data through our initialization or through our process state, we can process that data into queues and we can throw it and then we're done. Or we can do a click through automation. We can open up an application. We can click through the different pages and transitions we need to go through in that application, enter the data into that application we need to enter, and then we're done with the process when that process is done. Okay. This would be for processes or transactions that do not follow a transaction model, where you're not going out to a queue and getting a transaction, individual transaction data. Okay. Couple more things we need to do here on this process is we're going to go down here and we're going to start with our variables tab right here. And I'm going to get rid of everything that says transaction or retry. Okay. I'm going to go to my arguments tab because in this instance, I'm not using a queue in Orchestrator on a click through. If I'm loading a queue, I'll leave my Orchestrator queue name. That just depends on what you're going to be doing. Again, I'll probably end up flubbing up and calling it a queue build because that's what we call these in Mary Kay, but it's a queue build. All right. Now you're going to see where I have some errors appearing in my process because I got rid of things that said transactions. So the first thing I'm going to go is I'm going to go up into my configuration state, my first run, which is where I'm reading my configuration file. And I'm going to, in this case, I'm keeping the Orchestrator queue name because I'm going to be loading a queue. If I wasn't, I would show, because I would have had deleted this guy. If it was a click through and you'll see an error here, I would just delete that block. But let's just say we are loading a queue. Let me put that argument back in there. Okay. The next thing you're going to see is you're going to have an error down in this guy. And this one's a little bit more difficult to find. So you're going to click on your process and you're going to open up this process workflow block. You're going to see some arguments tied to it down here. And one of those arguments is in transaction item. If you remember, we deleted everything that was a transaction because we're not necessarily working with transactions. So I'm going to delete that guy. I'm going to save him really quick. And you'll notice that I still have an error here, but let's clear this orange. I'm just going to click in there, reset my workflow arguments just by clicking. And there it goes. It's going to change to blue. The second error is going to be found down here in your finally section. This is where you're going to find your set transaction status. That's over here in your framework, set transaction status. Okay. I'm going to double click on that guy and it's a try catch. If you remember, everything in an REFramework is going to be in try catches. You see that this is where we're having some errors in here. So I'm going to open my workflow and I'm going to correct those errors. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to arguments. And again, I'm going to take out everything that says transaction or retry. Okay. And I'll make sure that way I can see the full breadth and scope of my errors. Okay. The first thing I'm going to get is this increment transaction index. Okay. We're not using transactions, so we're just going to take out that whole little guy right there. All right. If we have a successful transaction, you can see we deleted everything that says transaction item. So we're just going to delete the blocks that have to do with transaction item. I'm going to delete, and I'm going to go ahead and delete these transaction log fields. So I'm just have a simple log message that says your automation was successful. Okay. I'm going to go into my business exception. Now, this is your business rule exception. This is the one that you just repointed to go to the end of your automation. So if you have a rule breakage in your process, it's going to go to the end of the automation. Again, I'm going to delete my transaction items. Okay. And then finally, we have system exception. If you remember, system exception is not a business rule. That system exception is going to go back to the beginning of the initialization state and start the process over and try to do the process again. That could be your application idled out, your application changed, your selectors changed, the vendor did an upgrade over the weekend that you weren't aware of and wasn't in the release notes, and so now your automation is not working. So that's a system exception. You see a system exception has a few more items than anything else. So I'm going to take out my queue retry because we're not going to retry. I'm not going to retry any items in the queue because I'm not using a queue. I may be loading a queue, but I'm not reading data from a queue. So I'm going to take out my queue retries. And this is a transaction. So I'm going to delete that whole block because it has to do with that if statement has to do with the transaction. Take out my transaction log fields. And here we have a retry current transaction workflow. That's also over here in your framework. I'm just going to delete that guy as well because I'm not doing a transaction. That leaves me with take a screenshot. And that leaves me with close application. So what happens if in a system exception, your bot's going to take a screenshot because you may not necessarily know if it's working in the background. You may not necessarily, or if you're working in a production server that you have no access to, you're not going to necessarily know what the bot saw when it encountered that error. So you want the bot to take a screenshot to show you what the bot sees. All right, so you can troubleshoot. And then you want the bot to close all the applications that it currently has open and try again, if that's your desire. All right, so if I save my set transaction status and I reset my import arguments, I should have 3: config, system exception, and business exception. Okay, and it's blue, that means it's reset. And I'm going to come back up here to main, and I'm going to save. So in doing that process and taking out that transaction segment, that state, I have changed this RE framework into a linear process, an RE framework for linear process. There is another way to do this, leaving that transaction state in. But before I go forward with that, does anybody have any questions about how we do it when we just take out the transaction data piece? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right. Second way to do it, you open up my framework too. As you can see, this is a normal RE framework. Okay. Here, I'm modifying it again for a linear process. So I'm taking my, this guy used to be over here, and this guy used to be over here. That's a regular RE framework. Again, I'm going to take my success. I'm going to drag him over to in process. I'm going to take my business exception. I'm going to drag him over to in process. Okay. Here, however, I'm going to do something a little bit different in this guy. This guy's not changing, but this guy might or needs to. This is a normal transaction data, get transaction data. And what we're going to worry about is this little guy right here. So I'm going to open up this workflow. And the first thing I'm going to notice is on a regular RE framework. Let me open up another RE framework. Bear with me one moment, so that I can make sure that you see this. As you can see, I teach a lot of people, so I have a lot of RE frameworks raring to go. Let's see if this one is a blank one that I haven't already destroyed. And I have not destroyed that. All right, in this get transaction data, you're going to see in this first place, in a regular RE framework, you're going to see this get transaction item. Okay. When you're doing a linear process and leaving in the transaction state, we're going to get rid of this guy, just like that, because we're not getting a transaction item. All right. If you'll notice on your, let me get back over here, guys. On your variables, your transaction number defaults to 1. In the default RE framework, defaults to 1. So your first transaction is going to be number 1, right? In this case, it's going to be your only transaction, is transaction number 1. All right. So what I want to do then is I'm just going to come in this guy and I'm going to say, just do a quick if statement. I'm going to say if in transaction number equals 1, then I'm going to do a quick assign in transaction, or is it out transaction item. I'm just going to change it into a string. I'm just going to say anything you want it to say. I'm going to say yes. You notice I have an automatic error because my out transaction item is set up as a queue item. So we're just going to change that guy to a string. Okay. Now, if my out transaction item is now the string, I'm just going to do a quick log message to say this is a linear process. Okay. And on this other side of the else, I'm going to say out transaction item equals nothing. That means if my in transaction, if I have one transaction, it's defaulted to 1, it's going to come in here and say, okay, I'm linear. Okay. If there's 2 transactions, then you shouldn't be using a linear process. You should be using a transactional process. Then I'm going to just tell my bot out transaction item is nothing. Okay. So what your bot's going to now do, it's going to go through this transaction data. And if you notice, I left everything else in. If it's not nothing, because these are just defaults. A transaction ID is the date. Out transaction field, it's an empty string, an empty string. You don't need to take this piece out necessarily. It's not going to hurt the bot to go through this and say, okay, out transaction field 1 is empty. But in doing so, I've avoided this get transaction data. Okay, I've negated it. I've disabled it. Okay, I can go, now I'm going to go straight from initialization to process transaction. Okay, one other thing you've got to do is you've got to come into this finally state and still do the same thing on your finally state. Now, let me find my finally state. Sorry, I'm jumping around here, guys. I'm getting mixed up in my things. There he is. I'm still going to have to manipulate this guy. I'm still going to have to take this guy out because I'm not going to be retrying my transaction because it's just a simple linear process. I'm still going to have to go into success. And I'm going to take out everything that has to do with transaction item. Okay. In order for this to run properly. Okay. I'm going to have to take those things out. I'm going to have to do the same thing. The key thing that you're doing here is you're going to change this out transaction item to a string. Just assign any string you want to it. It could be your name. It could be whatever you want. As long as you're assigning it to something that's a string, and then you're negating this guy. Now, so you're asking me, why do I like to do this guy and remove that whole piece? Now, opened up the wrong one. This is the one I wanted. Not this one. Because I like my automations clean. That's the only reason I don't use the other process. I'm used to this process. This is the way I've always done it. And I sound like a business person saying, I've always done it this way. Why would I want to do it a different way? I've just always done it this way. I like having clean variables. I like having clean arguments. And I just use this process where I take out that transaction data field. It generally doesn't take any more time than doing the other way, but I just like doing it this way because it's cleaner to me. And I'm just that way with my code. You can do it however which way you want, and I can send you each of these wrapped up in a zip file so you can dig through them and play with each one of them. All right. Other things that we can do in our robotic process framework, talked about dispatcher, is we can add states. Okay. Just remember, when you're adding a state to a state machine, that your states need to be attached, okay? Everything needs to be attached. You can see, you can't see this guy here, but he's attached down here. Now, what I did here is just gave you an example. You can add a new state just from your design panel over here. If you go to activities, you just do a state. And I want to add a state. Did I miss it? A state. I can just throw a state in here. And if I want something to happen between system exception and restarting the process, I can create a new state here. If I want something to happen between a successful run or a business exception and a successful run, I can add a new state here. So you can add states to your RE framework. Now, I've had people say to me, well, my company that I work for, my organization doesn't want us modifying the RE framework because it's their standard, it's their policy. The RE framework is designed as a default template. And we modify default templates based upon the business need and the automation that we're building. I don't know necessarily of an RE framework that is going to work for all automation types, all automation scenarios, all business processes without some sort of modification. Now, granted, I don't often add states. I do add states. I don't often add states, but I do always add try catches and if I'm opening up an email application, for example, or if I'm opening up a PDF application, or if I'm opening up two different applications, web-based applications in my automation, I'm going to give them each a different error down here, and I'm going to drag new transitions. So in essence, I'm adding to my states. I'm modifying my RE framework because I want to make sure that I'm capturing all the possible exceptions that I can capture. If I'm taking out this transaction field, yes, I'm modifying my RE framework, but I'm still within the RE framework benefits, getting the exception planning, getting the screenshots, getting the state machine, which is the ideal way to build an automation. And we're still within that state machine. It's just a little bit cleaner. Or even if I go over here where I've modified and I've negated and disabled this get transaction data, I'm still modifying my RE framework in a sense. Okay, so if we keep in mind that the RE framework is designed as a template, because that's what it is, it's a template that you're going to be using as a tool to build your automation in, that you may have to modify to some degree in order for that automation to be optimal. That's when we modify the RE framework. And I don't know if there's other MVPs on the call or not, but I will tell you, most MVPs will tell you, I modify my RE frameworks. So if that is a company policy that you always have to have the transaction state in there, then I think we need to build some business cases to demonstrate where that's not necessarily going to be the ideal or optimal format for the automation. And again, at Mary Kay, we do have a corporate policy that says we build everything in a framework, in the RE framework. We can modify that RE framework, but everything gets built within an RE framework. Okay. One other thing that you want to keep in mind when you're working with the RE framework is you want the bot not just to do a log message with an error, take a screenshot with an error. You want the bot to communicate with your business team. You want the bot to send that team an email saying, hey, I got your process, I got your template, or I got your data, I'm going to begin processing it now. Or if the bot runs into an application error, you want that business team to know, in case it's a critical process, and some of ours are, especially when we're dealing with things like payroll. That's pretty critical to most people. You want that bot to communicate to that payroll department, hey, I can't process this right now because Oracle's down, or I can't get into Oracle, and I need you to do manual processing. So you want your bot to communicate outwards into your organization when you're running into exceptions And even to you as to the person that's building it, to the developer. So the developer, especially when you have an application exception and your application is not opening or your application changed over the weekend, you want to be able to communicate and troubleshoot with your systems teams so that you can make sure, did the release notes say that? How did we miss that? And you can head off some of that troubleshooting at the front end. All right. So we always, in our RE frameworks, we always want the bot to be communicating with the business team, the developer. Some even communicate directly with our system admins when they run into an issue. So the system admins can go in and see what happened, especially ours that are more persistent. A persistent automation would be an automation that runs for a longer period of time. Sometimes we schedule our persistent automations to run overnight. I'm asleep, but we have a system admin that's on call all night. So they can go in there and troubleshoot that automation when it's running overnight and runs into a problem. Otherwise, you may wake up in the morning and your automation has been running 8 times in a loop for a system application error because the application is not open or someone brought it down for security patching. And your automation is continually running because of that. That was quick and dirty. Did I totally lose everybody, or does everybody understand?
Feel free to take yourself off mute and talk if you guys want.
Was great. Thank you, Chris.
So Chris, you do have a couple questions.
Okay.
How should you modify the framework to handle scenarios where it might seem we have 2 loops of transactions? Example, we have multiple Excel files and the transaction item would be a row.
You can put, if you're gonna, now this is not my preference, okay? I'm gonna be honest with you. I do not load in my RE framework my transaction items. You can modify this transaction data to be a system file, an IO file, in-out file. And you can read each one of those rows becomes a new transaction item, okay? Again, as I said at the beginning, I don't do that because what we do in my world is auditable. And I want that queue history. And so I maintain that queue history so I can download my queue history from Orchestrator, which we'll show you in a future session and show you what that queue history says and the information that it provides for audit backup. If I have multiple Excel files and your data is different for each Excel file, then you're going to have 2 different dispatchers. Remember, the benefit of having a dispatcher performer model is in a dispatcher model that you're building your queues, all of the data has the same format. It may not have your data pieces may not each have a value for a certain piece. Let's say for an invoices, for example, you may have an invoice number, you may have an accounting date, you may have a vendor number, you may have an invoice date, you may have a discount. Not all invoices will have a discount, but there will be some invoices that do, and you want to capture that in a queue. It's going to still be in your queue. It's just going to be a null value because there's nothing there for discount or discount date or something like that. So the benefit of doing a dispatcher model is that you can load all your queue items will have the same exact data. And that way you can have multiple bots that are processing that queue. Now, if your 2 Excel streams coming in have different data type or different data points, then you'll want to do a different queue, if that makes sense, because your queues you want your queues to be standard in a dispatcher performer model so that your bots on the performer side can consistently process that data. So if you're going to have 2 different Excel streams coming in and each of those Excel streams coming in has different data points, then you'll want to do 2 different queues. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, and Chris, there's one more question. By doing so, REFramework initially states 3 state machines, but now it has only 3 states. So I don't know if you can talk maybe to.
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's Shabam. Do you want to come off mute and ask the question?
So my question question was randomly say when the first workflow was going on, when the first RE framework was going on. So I got the answer that we can individually perform our operations, or you can say that we can individually modify our RE framework according to our scenario. That makes an easy task to handle exceptions.
I'm sorry, I'm still lost on what exactly the question is, if you don't mind, and I apologize.
Question, it's a question as the UiPath says now that we have 4-state machines, 4 states. First one is initialization, process transaction, get transaction item, and process.
Mhm.
At that time, my question was that why we should have 3 states in regarding to the 4 states. So your answer was that yeah, I got an answer that we can easily adopt our choice to modify the RE framework
Yes,
according to our
you can have a
scenario.
4-state RE framework if you inactivate this guy. Okay, or
Yeah.
you can have a 3-state RE framework where you take that guy completely out. Let's just take these states out. You take that guy completely out, right? Let me take this back up.
Yeah.
Here.
It takes an easy task to perform our operations and to handle our system exceptions or business exceptions.
Correct.
Yeah, I got an answer. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect.
Hey, Chris, this is Antoine. How are you?
Oh gosh, Antoine. Antoine, how's it going?
I know you miss me. I know you miss me. I like what you were talking about with the Excel file. Were you trying to say that instead of uploading the file, you can do row by row and
Yeah,
it
sure.
track an orchestrator?
Sure. You can do a mass upload. Let me see if my version hit here. Q. You can do a bulk upload, bulk add queue items if you're working with an Excel file, or you can add individual queue items when you're through like a for each loop. So if you're doing a for each loop and you're looping through each row,
Yep.
okay, then you can put a queue item in that for each loop, and so that each row will be added into your queue item. So let's say, for example, here in my process, say we just have, I'm just going to throw a sequence in there, and I'm just going to add my queue item in a for each loop. So if I did a for each, oh, sorry guys. Come on, Chris. Let's say I'm reading, if ideally I'm going to be reading an Excel spreadsheet, which is going to turn it into a data table, correct?
Right.
I'm going to iterate through each row of my data table. And remember, you don't have to necessarily, let's just do DT. You don't necessarily have to do row. You can do line. If you're working with files,
Yep.
You can do file. And I'm just going to add, now if I may want to, if I need to normalize some data, maybe the date's coming out as a text, or your dollar amount's coming out as in your Excel spreadsheet as a text. I want to convert that to a double or whatever it might be. I would do all that before I add my queue item. And on my queue item, I would name over here my queue name. Usually I point to this in my configuration file in config, whatever my queue name is, my orchestrator queue name. And I'm going to add my collection. So it's just a really simple in argument. So I may have invoice number, okay, and that may be row item invoice number, and on and on and on like that. I would add that into my queue. So in my queue, I would have a line item of invoice number. I may have a line item of, like we were using earlier, discount. And that may be row item discount, right? Now, if row item, if there is no discount on your invoice, this is just going to show up in your Excel. You're still going to have the discount category in your orchestrator queue. It's just not going to have a value to it. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And
Thanks
by
so
the way, Antoine, last week you had questions about the global exception handler and things like that. Did my emails answer those for you?
Yes, they did. Appreciate it. I think there was a follow-up question that was written related to the queue item.
Is there another question, Diane?
How to track follow-up on queue items that errored out. Is there a way to generate a report for business from queue?
Oh, sure. To generate a report from the business to the business from the queue? Yes. But I think the data on the queue and coming out of the queue is going to be a little bit more confusing to the business. Typically, what I do when I have a queue item that doesn't match the business rules or has some sort of error associated with it, I always create what I call an anomaly file. And you have to remember that the business side, the people you're building for, don't necessarily understand RPA, may not be familiar with what RPA looks like. And so the data coming out of your queues can be a little bit discombobulating for them. If you just send it to them and say, hey, here's your queue items. What I typically do is I build an anomaly file. And in my end state, I typically put something in my end state before my close, where I would say, read my anomaly file. If the anomaly file rows are greater than 0, then attach it to an email, send it to the business teams. They know what items did not load or had problems. And that happens to us all the time because businesses are dealing with a lot of transactions, especially when you're talking about in a manufacturing industry like Mary Kay, where you're building items from raw materials. Each one of those raw materials has a certain measurement. Each one has a certain cost to it, things like that, that all go into this bill of materials. So we often have times where our business side will make a mistake on a template where we're reading from the template and adding it to a queue, or the invoice information is not all there, or the necessary information I need is not there, or even when you have we have bots that do so many different things, but when we always tend to include an anomaly file, because number one, we can load those anomalies into a build DT, write those anomalies into an Excel spreadsheet and send that to the business. It's much easier for the business to understand at that point what was missing, what was wrong, because we can even build some comments into that anomaly file. Hey, your cost was wrong, or your cost wasn't there, and we need the cost for this raw material. So I typically build an anomaly file that then I send to the business at the end. And if there are no rows in the anomaly file, they have no problems. They have nothing to address. Their process was done successfully, and all the components of what they needed for their business process were there. If they get an anomaly file, then they typically can work on that anomaly file and resubmit that transaction data to the bot for processing. I just find that's easier. It's more friendly to the business side than sending them a download from your queue. Hope that answered that question.
Thank you.
Thank you. It does. That's what we are doing at this time. I just wanted to find out if there is any other way, any other easy way to query from Orchestrator or something like that. Thank you.
No, I don't know if it's a question, Sri, about easiness as much as it is about user friendliness for the business side, because the more that the business understands, especially when you've got, and I don't know if your organization is like this, at Mary Kay, we have people that have been at Mary Kay for 30, 40 years. And they're often intimidated by new technology, especially the technology that's created to replace tasks that they do. And so the more user-friendly you make your bot, the more accepted your bot is, the more you'll get people coming to you with new bot processes, because they trust what the bot's done, because they've worked with the bot, they've seen the outputs, and they understand it's not quite as intimidating as it originally was. So I'm not sure if it's about quickness as much as it's about keeping the needs of your business in mind.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you that we cannot share what we are getting out of Orchestrator, but maybe if there is a way to get out of I mean, if we can query Orchestrator, maybe we can format the data the way that users can read, right?
And you can get the download from Orchestrator. You would have to iterate through the timing of that. So your Orchestrator, if let's say we have some invoice Q3 that have over 10,000 items in them, right? Because that the bot's processed. You would need to make sure that you're defining your query from Orchestrator to filter that stuff so that they're not getting 10,000 items and they have to dig through it. That's simply why we use the anomaly file, because it's more directed to just that data set that came into the automation at that particular point.
Got it. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, about data. I know we can, this is Antoine again. I know we can quickly upload a data table to SQL Server table, but I'm trying to upload the same data table to GCP table without having to go through the bucket and all that. Now I can do a update statement for one line item, per item. But when you have thousands of rows, you just want to take, hey, give me everything from the data table uploaded to this GCP table, and I'm not having an easy way to find it. We're actually looking at Python to do that, unfortunately, because so we're taking it to SQL Server and then taking the table from SQL Server using Python and here and getting it over to GCP.
So are you writing against SQL Server? Are you doing a SQL statement against a SQL database?
Yes, so I get the data from, say, an email, and then I take that data, write it to the SQL table through UiPath. It's a simple statement.
Sure.
And then now I have to use Python to take the information from the SQL table over to GCP without having to go through a bucket and all that stuff. But I thought it'd be a nice, easier write statement, from UiPath to GCP.
Yeah, we are doing that for most of our process because of the complexity with the queues. We didn't get used to the queue functionality yet.
You're using Python also?
No, we are using Oracle with queries, with just SQL queries.
Oh, SQL queries, yeah. So wait, are you taking the data from the SQL table and putting it into the GCP table, or is everything still in SQL, in the SQL tables?
What is GCP tables? I'm sorry.
Google Cloud Platform.
No, we are using our own servers, Oracle servers, to load our data.
Okay.
Are you having an FTP issue with your Google Cloud?
Well, it's telling us we have to, take a file. Typically, when you manually do it, you have to take, say, a CSV. You have to drop it in the bucket in Google Cloud Platform, and then from there, from the bucket, you're able to upload to a GCP table and the database there. So, I can write from UiPath. If I wanted to do one line of information, I can write that one line statement, append yada, yada, yada with the values and update the table to GCP. But if I have a full, 1,000 row data table, that would mean I'd have to do a for each for every line. And I don't want to do that. I want to avoid that.
And you're going to run into some persistence if you do that, because you're starting to run into big data questions.
Yeah.
And UiPath is not necessarily designed for big data, because you're going to run really slow, especially if you start to try and debug that sucker. I'm not, to be honest with you, Antoine, I'm not familiar with the Google Cloud Protocol. I'm an AWS guy. And we have a lot of automations that query a SQL server and query databases. But I don't think I'm versed enough to answer a question about the Google because I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, no problem.
Sorry
Thank you.
about that.
No problem. I will keep you guys updated when we find a solution.
Yeah, I don't know if you're talking tens of thousands of rows of data with any variability of column numbers, you're running into some persistence problems with your data. If you wanted to use UiPath for it, you'd have to somehow segment your data into smaller data sets to get that speed and the efficiency that UiPath would offer. Otherwise, I don't know how that would work with the Google Cloud Protocol.
Okay, cool.
Sorry. Nothing else?
Yeah,
Right.
feel free to take yourself off mute if you guys have questions. This is really a time to participate and ask any questions you have. Okay.
So I was curious about the global exception handler. Do you customize it or use it somehow?
Well,
Because
I do use
I
global
know it
exception.
exists.
We do use global exception handler. The global exception handler is going to retry your exception however many times that you tell it to. Let me open one up. So if we're going up to, we want to install a global exception handler, you can only have one per automation. Keep that in mind. And you cannot take the arguments out of your global exception handler. So if I want to do a global exception handler, I'm just going to open it up here. And I'm just going to save it because it's going to save as part of it's going to save down here. So I'm just going to create a global exception handler. And you can see that it's going to be down here next to my main. Okay. So here's where you would want to say it's going to default to 3. If you want to say, I want it to retry twice. Remember, the first time is always 0. So if I want a global exception handler for 2, I've put 2 there. One thing you need to keep in mind that I was communicating to Antoine with that last week is your global exception handler is going to reprocess, is also going to do that on your business rule exceptions. Now, business rule exceptions, and by the default of a modified or even of get transaction data, it's going to try and get your transaction data however many times. It's going to try and process that business rule exception several times as well, or how many times that you have it set up in your framework. Where did I put that guy? Where's my global exception handler? Okay, here. So on my global handler, I'd probably want to do something in here on an if statement. And do something around the system error name is a business rule exception, a BRE for short, then I don't want it to handle my BREs. I just want to handle my system exceptions, and I would throw it over there. That way it's avoiding retrying my BREs, especially if your BRE is going to the end state. You can't try retry an automation that's ended, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
And I can, if you want to put your email out there, I do have an example of that I shared with a couple of the people that attended last week. I can send it to you. The other thing in the newer versions of UiPath, you have what's called the max consecutive error. I don't have it in this version. It's going to be an entry on your config file where you would tell it how many times you want it to retry something. It comes in especially handy if your system is not opening and you have a system exception. Let me get to one that's not been dorked with so I don't confuse you. If you notice that your system exception is going to go to restart and retry. Well, the assumption is, like we talked about last week, if your application's changed to an upgrade over the weekend, it's not going to work on a retry either. It's not going to miraculously change in the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes that you've tried to deal with your automation. So a max consecutive retry, a max consecutive exception rule says, okay, I want you to retry it once or retry twice. You're going to set that up into your config file, and it's going to appear, and I'm not sure what version you're on. It's going to appear over here in your framework, and it'll be sitting up that it's just simple if else, and it's going to be sitting up here in your initialization state. And that's on the newer versions of UiPath. So it's going to be in your initialization state up here. And let's say your system application doesn't open. You want to retry it twice. You're going to set your max consecutive config entry to 2, and it will retry it twice before it actually throws an error. And it's going to throw an error, and your automation will go to the end state. That answer your questions about GRE?
Yeah. Thank you. I've seen the max consecutive retries on the newer version of the REFramework.
Yes, it's one of the updates that were made in 2022. And there's a way that you can manually code that. I'm not going to go into that right now, but you can manually increase a counter for your exceptions and handle it within your code. But the if-else statement that's in the newer versions handles that for you. The GEH, the global exception handler, is going to handle an exception twice. But you want to, if you're using a BRE, a business rule exception, you want to make sure that you count that out in an if statement, so it doesn't try and handle those multiple times. Okay, Diane, I don't have anything else unless anybody has any more questions.
Yeah, I did want to just say that Chris did say that he could wrap up some files if you guys are interested. Wrap up the tab at the top of the page. So if you are interested in that, can you please put your emails in the chat? And we'll do one more call out for any questions you guys have. Great. So I think that's a wrap, Chris.
All right, guys.
Thank you, Chris, for the session tonight. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
And so we're on for October 3rd.
Thanks,
All right,
Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
One question last. As the session is going to end, can I have the 12th September session available in the anywhere? Because I didn't attend the first session of REFramework. It was a second part, na, REFramework. So can I get the first part anywhere?